across the state yesterday, and colors are coming out. It's really just from one day to the next. Drive down on Friday, drove back yesterday, and it was even better. So try to get out and enjoy those fall colors. If you're new here, visiting for a second time, and we'd ask you to do us a favor. There's a green card in the seat back in front of you. If you could fill that out and drop it in that green box back by the door, that'd be great. Also for regular tenders, that's where you can put any contributions. Again, you all know about the Children's Wiggle Room. If you need room to roam with your kids, there's a room, a third door on the right in the children's area where you can go, and the service is being streamed, and you can. There's a little more room to roam in there. Coming up on this Friday and Saturday, we're participating with many churches across the city on Feed My Starving Children, packing meals that'll be shared internationally in the neediest places. Their goal is to pack 100,000 meals in those 2 days. They're looking for 500 volunteers, and have about 320 so far. There's about 20 signed up here. There's still time to sign up if you are interested in that. This Friday and Saturday, it's 2-hour shifts. Let me know, and I can get you signed up. Simple as that. I've got the times, and you can participate in that. So let me know. Youth Rendezvous is coming up October 9th. That's next Sunday. Yes. Wow. Next Sunday, October 9th. If you've got kids 9 to 15 years old, that's an opportunity for them to learn some outdoor skills and have a lot of fun. And I know it's something that the kids look forward to every year. Today's the last day to sign up. So there's a table out in the foyer. If you've got friends, relatives, neighbors that would like to participate, that's a great idea too. So Youth Rendezvous. If you have any questions, you can talk to Rob Gerber. And last but not least, the Fusion Conference, just to save the date, January 5th through the 7th at Wisconsin Dells. Information's in the bulletin, and check that out. It's a regional conference of churches that we're affiliated with, and real valuable time. So Rob's walking up, so I better stop talking.
Yeah, clear the stage. It's my turn. All right. Well, good to see everybody here. Like Mark said, it is fall, and this is a fun time of year. But it's good to be here. It really, truly is. I think sometimes we can think that, oh my gosh, the weather's so nice, and I should just stay home and stay outside and see the trees and work in the yard or whatever. And I get that. These days are short. There aren't a whole lot of them, and so it's tempting to think, well, I need to stop doing other things, like I'm not going to come to church and I'm going to go out there. But I really think that when God made this world, and God made you, and He put you in it. And the reason you and I love this kind of weather is because God put that inside of us. The reason you and I love to see those trees is because there's something in us that sees that beauty, and it just stirs our soul. That's how God designed us. So all of the stuff that we love out there, it really is at its fullest. It really speaks to us the most. It is the most joyful when we're in touch with God, when we're walking with God, because that's how we were designed to be. And so being here, this is not taken away from enjoying the fall. This really, truly is setting you up to just enjoy being out there for the next however long we get this. And then we get winter, and I love winter. I'm not going to lie to you. When it's 40 degrees and sleeting, I'm a happy fellow. All right, but it's not that today. And so what we're going to do here for the next few minutes is we're going back to our Genesis series. If you've been here for a while, you know that we have been going through the book of Genesis. That's a big book. We're going through it slowly, little bits at a time, taking it from the beginning all the way to the end. But we'll do 4, 5, 6 weeks on Genesis. Then we'll stop, catch our breath, talk about something else for a little while, pick Genesis back up again. Well, today we're picking Genesis back up, and if you do have one, grab your binders. These Genesis binders, they're out there with notes. There's notes for today's message on the table out there. If you don't have one of these binders and you want one, you might want to grab one because we're going to be going through Genesis for a long time. $5 you can, and all of the notes for the previous messages are out there if you want to catch up, and you can listen to them online if you missed any. So today we're picking back up with Genesis. And where we're at today is Genesis chapter 10. That's where we left off. Matt went through Genesis chapter 9. We just got done talking about Noah and the flood and all of that, and now we're done with Noah, and we're moving on. So today we're going to go through Genesis actually quite a bit. We're going to look at the last part of Genesis chapter 9, all of Genesis chapter 10, and then part of Genesis chapter 11. Don't you hate that? It's like your teacher tells you, we're going to study 4 chapters today in algebra or something like that. It's not that bad. There's a reason for this passage, and I want to talk about it today. So this is typically called the Table of Nations, Genesis 9, 10, and 11. It's about Noah's sons, and it's about it's called the Table of Nations. And so what it is really is it's a lot of talk of the people who come from Noah and end up in Abraham. So Noah and Abraham are these 2 big characters in Genesis, and where we're at right now is it's kind of a bridge from Noah to Abraham. And this section, these 2 or 2.5 chapters or so, the Bible is all kinds of different things. Some of the Bible is instruction, like if you read perhaps in the book of Galatians, where it's instruction. It was a letter written to a church where Paul, the guy that wrote it, he's instructing the church on how to conduct themselves, how to think, that kind of stuff. Some of the Bible is inspiration, like you read the Psalms and they're stirring, they're inspiring, they stir your soul. Some of the Bible is information. It's just telling you facts and things. That's what we're talking about here. This chunk, it's informational. There's an awful lot of information in here, and it can be, sometimes when it gets too much information, it gets hard to assimilate. This is one of those chunks that if you just read it, it might seem a little bit hard to assimilate because it's a lot of names. So-and-so had 8 boys, and then his first boy had 4 boys, and then this and that, and it's a lot of things like that. But there is a purpose to this, and there are some very powerful things that I think God wants to tell us in here. And the first is this. This is a bridge. We're seeing the bridge from Noah to Abraham. When we started talking about Genesis, we said that this is in the form of a story. And when I say story, I don't mean fictional. That we believe that Genesis is fact. We believe that this is recorded history. But it's told in the form of a narrative, a story. And so it's people, places, and events, things that happened. We said that in a story, sometimes you kind of jump forward or backward and you don't talk about absolutely everything. Well, that's kind of what this is. This is a bridge in the story from Noah. He played a huge part in this. And we're going to Abraham. He plays a huge part in it. But in between here is how we got from Noah to Abraham. So it's kind of a big part of the story that we're not spending a whole lot of time talking about. We're not learning a lot about these people and some of these generations. So it's a bridge there. God is just giving us, okay, we're going to kind of jump ahead to Abraham, but he gives us something here. So it's kind of a bridge. And it's also information. Well, it's this chart here here from, this is kind of how Genesis has played out so far. We started with creation, and then we went to the fall of man. Then we talked about the flood and Noah, and we're moving on to Abraham, but now we're in that third blue arrow, okay? That's where today's text is. It's that bridge from Noah to Abraham. But it's also, this is called the Table of Nations. And this is, if you're into this kind of thing, this is a fascinating little chunk of the Bible because in it we see the origin of a lot of the nations and races in the world. If you read through this, particularly in chapter 10, you'll see so-and-so was born to so-and-so, and from this guy came this race. This guy is where the Egyptians came from. This guy is where the Assyrians came from. This guy was the father of this race, this nation. And that's why it's called the Table of Nations, because we see the origins of a lot of the nations that we still see today. We're not going to spend a ton of time with that, but if you're interested, this is a good article here. This is in, Tommy, can you give me that next slide? This is... Didn't I put a slide in there about? Oh, never mind. It's coming up. Hold your horses, Rob. I'm getting ahead of myself. Slow down. I'll talk about that in a minute. But this is the second thing. Okay, so I said that this chunk is a bridge from Noah to Abraham. But the second thing is, it's a reminder of something. This is not just information. As we look at this information, we do learn things. If you remember, we said at the beginning of this that Genesis was designed to give us some things. Genesis is a book of beginnings, and one of the things that God wants us to take out of this book is we get to know about Him. We learn about who God is. We learn about how God functions. Genesis is filled with that. And as we read Genesis, we see, oh, this is what's important to God. Oh, this is how God operates. This is who God is. And we see that here, and there's a reminder as you read this that God is in control. Because we see the origins of these nations, and we see that God sees it and He understands it. In other words, the world is not just happening by random chance. The world is not completely under your control and my control. God sees, God understands, and God still retains control. And this chapter is a reminder of it because we see here how God says, I'm going to have this descendant, his people are going to move there, and they're going to become this race. They're going to become this nation. God has a plan. God is still in control of the world. We see that here. Here's the article that you might want to read. I think there you go. Enduring Word. Yeah, this is an article that you might want to read that lays out the author's understanding of all of these names and what nations they formed. EnduringWord.com. If you go to EnduringWord.com, Bible commentary Genesis 10. Can't miss it. It's a really good article that just kind of lays out some of these things. But back up, Tommy, to that verse in Acts 17. This helps us, I think, to understand. And we've talked in Genesis about how the Bible interprets the Bible. And here, way later in Acts, we see this about God. It says, for God did this, verse 26. From one man He made every nation of men, that they should inhabit the whole earth. And He determined the time set for them and the exact places where they should live. We see this happening here in Genesis chapter 9. From one man, first it was Adam, and then the flood came, and God says, I'm wiping out the earth except for Noah. And now from Noah we see this. From one man God made every nation of men. God made them that they should inhabit the whole earth. And God, determined the time set for them and the exact places where they should live. The geopolitical landscape of the world is not an accident. God created it. We see that here in Genesis chapter 9. And so if that interests you, you can read that article. It would help you to see this guy created this nation came from there. We're not going to spend a ton of time with that today. Here's the third thing that this chunk is. It's a commentary on the state of the world, which is another thing that we said Genesis was about. God intended Genesis to help us understand who He is, but also to understand who we are and to see the world around us accurately. God gives us insight into why things happen the way that they do. Genesis is filled with that. And so this chapter here is filled with, or it helps us to understand, it gives us kind of a commentary on the state of the world back then and even as it exists now, okay? So, all of that to say this is a really good section, and we're going to spend just a few minutes talking about it here and looking into it. How we're going to do that is I'm going to just share some observations that I get as I read the text. I'm not going to read this text. There's too much, and I can't pronounce the names, I'll be honest with you. So you can go and read it. I'm just going to make some commentary about some observations that I see in this text, and then we're going to draw some lessons from that. Kind of say, all right, that's what we see. What does that mean to me now? What do I learn from that? What do I take away from that, okay? So here we go. What are things, and you may see other things, but what are things that we see here in this text? Well, here's the first observation that I have. After the flood, some things haven't changed at all. From before the flood and after the flood, there are some things that haven't changed at all, both for good and for bad. For example, back in Genesis chapter 1, if you remember, God gave Adam and Eve a command, a commission, if you will, a mission. And he said this, God blessed them, Adam and Eve, and said to them, be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it. And so that's what God told Adam and Eve to do. And they set about doing that. They had children, and there were generations that were born, and they began to do that, and because that's what God had for them to do. That's what God asked them to do. Well, we see God say, and almost exactly the same thing in Genesis chapter 9 to Noah. Then God blessed Noah and his sons, saying to them, be fruitful and increase in number and fill the earth. It's the exact same thing. God's telling Noah to do the exact same thing that he told Adam and Eve to do. And so some things don't change at all. And we see that the nations and races of the earth emerging in fulfillment of God's command. From one man, God made every nation of men that they should inhabit the whole earth. That's what's happening here. He'd started with Adam and Eve, told them to do it. It had gone terribly wrong and terribly bad. God said, I'm going to judge the world and the people in it. He sent the flood, but now with Noah, he preserved Noah and Noah's sons out of the flood. And he says, now I want you to do the same thing. And we see it happening. Here in this section, we see, okay, Noah's 3 boys, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, they began to have children. And as the generations went on, these children formed races and nations and spread out over the whole world. It's the exact same thing. That didn't change from before the flood or after the flood. The nations and races of the world are emerging. They're being formed in fulfillment, really, of the command that God gave them. But here's another thing that's the same, and this isn't so good. We see conflict and strife on both sides of the flood. Remember, before the flood, God said he looked at the inclinations of man's heart, and they were just nothing but evil all the time. Well, that conflict and that strife is not changing now. There's still animosity. There is still... The world didn't get solved by the flood, unfortunately. Here in Genesis chapter 9, at the very end of Genesis chapter 9, as we're getting into chapter 10 and the table of nations, in verse 26, it says this is God speaking, blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem, may Canaan be a slave of Shem. May God extend the territory of Japheth, and may Japheth live in the tents of Shem, and may Canaan be his slave. So right at the very beginning of this new command to fill the earth and subdue it, what do we see? Conflict and strife. You guys are going to get along, but you're not going to get along here. Now, this is not a command of God. This is just a recognition of the reality that sin and strife and conflict survived the flood. So the nations and races of the world are emerging here at the command of God. They're being formed and they're emerging, but they are being formed and they are emerging in a world of conflict, in a world of sin, in a world of strife. That's not good. We would wish perhaps that would be different, but we see that happening. Right at the beginning, God says, all right, no, I want you to pick up where Adam and Eve left off, fill the earth, That's great. Unfortunately, you're going to do it the way they did it, which was it's going to be in a world of strife. It's going to be in a world of conflict because sin survived the flood. And so the nations and the races of the world are being formed in this environment of conflict and strife. And we see that right at the beginning. Before God even begins to tell us what nations came from where, he tells us these nations are in conflict. Canaan is in conflict with Shem and Japheth and his brothers. That's one thing I see as I read this. Here's another observation that I see here in this chapter, and that's this, that these struggles, these conflicts, and this strife begins with rebellion. The world's struggles begin with rebellion. In chapter 10, it's lots and lots of genealogies, and we looked at genealogies earlier in Genesis, but there's a lot of genealogies here, and it's so-and-so begat so-and-so who begat so-and-so. There's some added commentary here because God says, and from this descendant came the nation of Egypt or the nation of Libya or whatever. So there's a little bit more commentary. But there is one guy in here that is singled out, and we read something about him. He's the only guy that we really hear much about or get much filling in the gaps of. And it's this guy named Nimrod, which is, I laugh at that name. I mean, I don't know if it's still true, but when I was a boy, I called my buddies Nimrod. Yeah, Nimrod. I have no idea why, but we called each other Nimrods, and it wasn't a kind thing. But here, Nimrod, we see a guy that really was a guy named Nimrod. And it talks about him here. And it says an interesting thing about him. I'm just going to read this. This is in chapter 10, starting with verse 8. Cush was the father of Nimrod, who grew to be a mighty warrior on the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. That is why it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. The first centers of his kingdom were Babylon, Erech, Akkad, and a couple other places. From that land, he went into Assyria, where he built Nineveh. And so, kind of stuck in the middle of all these genealogies is a little bit of commentary about this guy named Nimrod. What's the significance of that? Well, when you look at that and think about that, it can seem innocuous a little bit, like, well, what's the big deal? He's a mighty warrior. In fact, I've used that. I've thought, that's great. I'd love to be a mighty warrior before the Lord, or a mighty hunter before the Lord. All you deer hunters out there, that's me. Lord, make me a mighty deer hunter before you. Just, we can look at that and think, well, that's not so bad. But if you look a little bit closer, I think you see something here that is not good. A couple things. What it says about Nimrod is he set up his own kingdom. This is the first time in the Bible we see a human, a man, setting up his own kingdom. Now, why is that significant, that Nimrod set up his own kingdom? It happens all over the place. Here's why. God said from the very beginning, I will be your king. God said, I am your king. I want you to serve me. I want you to be subject to me. And so right away here we see Nimrod who's saying something to God. It looks as if he's saying, well, you can have your kingdom, God, but I'm going to have my own kingdom. I'm going to set up my kingdom. That phrase, a mighty hunter before the Lord, that word before, the connotation there is in opposition to, against, almost face to face. That's the literal translation, face to face, but it's kind of like in a conflict. Nimrod, if you read this, was in conflict with the Lord, set up his own kingdom. And it's interesting, it says that the first center of his kingdom was in Babylon, and later he went and built Nineveh. It is so interesting to read about those two cities in the Bible. Babylon and Nineveh were two of the most wicked cities of antiquity, at least as far as the Bible is concerned. They were the most anti-God in many ways in the ancient world. And they are the beginning of this guy's kingdom. In fact, Babylon shows up all through the Bible, and it shows up at the very, very end of the Bible in the book of Revelation. And this is what it says about Revelation is talking about the end times, and it's making commentary about the state of the world. So here we see, with Nimrod, we see kind of the beginning of this new world after the flood. In Revelation, we see the end result of it, and it mentions Babylon. Here in chapter 17, verse 5, this title was written on her forehead. It's a picture of a sinful woman who is antagonistic toward God here in Revelation. It says, this title was written on her forehead, Mystery Babylon the Great, the mother of prostitutes and the abominations of the earth. What does that mean? Well, Babylon has been a picture throughout the Bible of rebellion against God. Abominations against the God. Prostitution is always used in relation to when they're talking about spirituality. It's talking about rebelling against God and giving yourself to another God. And Babylon is associated with that act, that rebellion against God throughout the Bible. And Nimrod started it. What do I learn from that? Well, I take, and this may just be me, you can chew on this, I think this, that the world's struggles, the conflict, where did it come from initially? It came from rebellion. That's what Adam and Eve did. They rebelled against God. Now we see it happening again. When we rebel against God, things go poorly. Sin is, at its heart, sin is rebellion. Sin is not doing a wrong thing. Sin is not making a mistake. At its core, sin is rebellion against God. I see you, God. I see what you say. I see what you want to be. You want to be my king. That means I need to submit myself to you. I don't want to do that. Instead, I'm going to set up my own kingdom. I'm going to make my own decisions. I see you, God. You say you want to care for me and love me, and you want me to love you back. Very similar to a husband and wife with the intimacy and the emotional passion. I see that. I'm going to go love something else. I'm going to give my love and receive love from something else. That's what sin is. It's rebellion against God. And from that flows all the stupid things that we do. From that flows hate and murder and theft and adultery and all of the things that we kind of think, oh, that's sin. No, those are just symptoms of sin. Sin is rebellion. The world struggles. What we see going on, I said that this world, these nations and races are being formed in this cauldron of conflict and strife. Well, the conflict and strife comes from rebellion against God, which is sin. And we see it here. We see it here. We're learning about the state of the world. The world is in rebellion to God. It has been since Adam and Eve. It is after the flood. That rebellion persists. Persisted then, and it persists to this day. One more observation, one more thing I see in here. We said that some things haven't changed. Nations and races are emerging in fulfillment to a command, but they're emerging and being formed in this atmosphere of sin and conflict. Second observation is that sin and conflict really comes from rebellion. Rebellion against God. And the world was filled with it back then, and that's how these nations and races were being formed. Here's a third thing I see in this chapter, or in this section. We see the ancestry of Abraham. We see where Abraham came from. Now, here's why this is important. Abraham is kind of the hero of the next section of Genesis. Hero meaning he's the main character of the next section of Genesis. And we're going to spend an awful lot of time in Genesis talking about Abraham. He takes up a big chunk of the book. And we see here where he came from. And in the second half of chapter 11 of Genesis, starting with verse 10, we see the ancestry of Abraham, how it went from Shem. Shem was one of Noah's sons, and it works through the descendants of Shem down to Abraham. And so we see that lineage, if you will. And we talked about that before when we looked at the genealogies earlier, why that's important, who we are and where we came from. Again, is something that God knows and understands, and it's important to us. And so we see that here, how Abraham came from Noah's line. But maybe more importantly, or why that's important. Why it's important for us to know kind of Abraham's history, Abraham's heritage, is because of what comes from Abraham going forward. We're looking back and seeing where Abraham came from, but that's important only because what comes from Abraham. And I'm not going to steal his thunder, but Mark is going to get into this. I will just read this one verse in Genesis chapter 12 when we start to look at Abraham. And it says this in verse 3. This is God speaking to Abraham as Abraham is beginning to interact with God. At the beginning of Abraham's part in this story, God is saying this to Abraham. In verse 3, he says, I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you I will curse, and all the peoples on earth will be blessed through you. All the peoples on earth will be blessed through you. You see, Abraham is a big deal because of what God is going to do through him. All the peoples on the earth will be blessed through Abraham. God is making a promise to Abraham. Your descendants, from the nation and the race that comes from you, is going to come my blessing, not just to your descendants, but to everybody in the whole world, all the nations. I'm going to use you, Abraham. You're going to be the father of the Jews, the father of Israel, the nation of Israel, the race of the Jews. And from that race, I'm going to bring a Savior that is not going to save just your descendants, Abraham, but all of these nations and races that we just talked about. All of them. He's making a promise here. That's why Abraham is important, because of what God is going to do in the future. And we see that here. And now next week, we're going to step into that story of how God begins to fulfill that promise and how God uses Abraham to fulfill the promise. Remember 2 weeks ago, when we were talking about walking with God, we said that there are men who walk with God, men who call upon God. Abraham is one of them. He began to call upon God, and God says, that's good. Now I'm going to use you, and I'm going to create something from you. And so we see that here in this chapter. So, some observations, things that I see as I read this text. Let's now broaden our view a little bit and say, all right, and there's other things you can see in there. I would encourage you to read this. Don't gloss over it. Read it. Let God speak to you. God will give you observations as well as you read this. But what are some lessons? Okay, that's what we see. What do I learn from that? That's the stuff. I said this is a lot of information that God is giving us. All right, what does that information do for me? How does it impact me? What do I learn from this? What are lessons that we take away from this? Here's one. Here's one lesson I take away. And that's this. God watches and directs the nations. God watches and directs the nations. He did then, and I believe he still does now. We read this verse earlier. May God extend the territory of Japheth. May Japheth live in the tents of Shem, and may Canaan be his slave. He's talking about nations here, because now next he goes on to say, here are the nations that came from Japheth. So when he says, may God extend the territory of Japheth, may Canaan be his slave, he's not talking about just those individuals and their relationships with each other. He's talking about the nations that will come from them, because that's what happens next. And we see that happening again and again and again. God watches, he sees, he's attentive to what's happening on the earth. God is attentive to what's happening on the earth. He's attentive to us as individuals because he says he's our Father and we're his children, but he is also attentive to nations because he says he is the king. He sits as king, and so he watches. He sees what's happening in the geopolitical world. He sees it, he watches it, he understands it, and he directs it when he chooses to. The Bible is filled with examples of that. Here in Daniel chapter 2, verse 21, it says, "Praise be to the name of God forever and ever. Wisdom and power are his. He changes times and seasons. He sets up kings and deposes them." God does that. God sets up kings and he takes them away. He claims that power. Here's another verse in Jeremiah. I just read this the other day. I've been reading through Jeremiah, and I ran across this verse in Jeremiah 27, verse 5, that says this. It says, "With my great power and outstretched arm, I made the earth and its people and the animals that are on it, and I give it to anyone I please." He's talking here about Nebuchadnezzar, who is the king of Babylon. So all of Jeremiah is a story of God directing nations. He says to the nation of Israel, this is many, many years after Genesis. He's saying, you have rebelled against me like you always have. Now I'm going to discipline you and punish you. Here's how I'm going to do it. I'm going to raise up a king over here in Babylon. His name is Nebuchadnezzar, and I'm going to give him power over everybody. God chose it. He said, this is what I'm going to do. I have a purpose for it, and I'm going to do it. I can do it. Why can I do it? Well, because I have great power. I have great power because I made this earth. I made it. I created it. I set up these nations. It's all there. I see it. I watch it. And when I choose to, I direct it. Now, I don't know what that does for you, but it gives me some comfort. Because when you look at the world around us, it seems as though it is out of control. I mean, you look at the world right now. Russia is invading Ukraine. The Cold War is back on. There's talk of nuclear war. And the leader of Russia has said, if things don't go my way, I'm not ruling out nuclear war. That's a fearful, fearful thing. You can look at our nation, and you can be afraid for what's happening. In the world we live in today, in the political climate we live in today, no matter which political persuasion you might lean toward, you have cause to look at the world and think, this is a fearful thing. I think this is going in a bad direction. And in one regard, that should not surprise us, folks. Why? Well, because the nations and the races formed in a culture of conflict and strife and rebellion and sin. This is how it's always been. It has always been this way. But that can seem out of control and fearful unless I remember, wait a minute, God is still king. God has not relinquished control. The world is not out of control. God gives us a shocking amount of free will, and we can mess things up pretty good, and we do often. But God says, I have not taken my hands off it completely. I am still watching the nations. I will raise up one, and I will put down another. I don't know what his plans are. He doesn't tell me. He doesn't tell us, but I trust him. I trust his power, and I trust him. The world is not out of control, but here's another thing that is not, for many of us, not quite as joyful. The world's not out of control, but it's also not completely in our control. That's the other side of this. We cannot control the geopolitical world as much as we wish we could. We can vote, and we should. We have an awful lot of say in what happens. We can do good or poorly, but the truth is that we have not been given complete and total autonomous control over our governments. We live in a world, I was raised in a democracy, and we celebrate that, and it's a wonderful thing. I am a big fan. I truly am. But the truth is that God has not said, okay, I like your form of government. You can have complete and total control over your government. That is not how this works. God is still the king of this nation, of every nation. For me, that gives me comfort. I'm very willing to surrender some of our control to God. I'm very willing to. But remember what Genesis is about? One of the things that it helps us to do is understand the world we live in, and I think this helps. This is a big lesson we can learn. The political world is not out of control, but it's not completely in our control. God is still king. God watches and directs nations. Here's a second lesson. That's one lesson I take from this chapter. Here's a second lesson I take from this chapter. And we talked about it a little bit, but we'll expand on it some. And that's this: sin survived, and its impact remains. Sin survived the flood, and its impact persists. Its impact remains. And we can't eliminate it. We can't make the symptoms or the results of sin go away. We wish we could, but we just can't eliminate it. See what happened in Genesis chapter 6? We see the condition of the world before the flood. Genesis 6, Verse 5, it says, "The Lord saw how great man's wickedness on the earth had become, and that every inclination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil all the time." That's a bad look. That's a bad statement on the condition of humanity before the flood. It would be nice if after the flood it was different. Unfortunately, it's not. In Romans, this is now thousands of years, generations later. In Romans chapter 3, verse 10, it says, "As it is written, there is no one righteous, not even one. There is no one who understands, no one who seeks God. All have turned away. They have together become worthless. There is no one who does good, not even one." Paul, the guy that wrote that, is writing to the New Testament times, our times. He's quoting an Old Testament verse. What it's doing here is we see that this condition is spanning the generations. It's spanning the ages. It's spanning the nations. It's spanning the races. Humanity, from the time of Adam till right exactly now, lives in a world that is sinful. Sin has survived, and the impact of sin persists. You remember what I said, that all of the bad things in the world are symptoms of sin. The sin itself is rebellion against God. I will be my own king. I will be my own. I'll find another lover. I will be my own boss. I will control my own destiny. That's rebellion against God, because those are things God says I will do as a God. When we rebel against God, that's sin, and it begins to produce all kinds of stuff that we don't like. Hate and racism and war. Those things are not the sins, they're the symptoms of the sin of rebelling against God. So when we here on this earth right now look at the symptoms of sin, we think we should change that. I don't like racism. I don't like it that the nations are in conflict with each other. I don't like that one race looks at another race and tries to subjugate them or something. I don't like that, so let's change it. And so when you watch the football games today, in the end zones and on the back of the helmets, there'll be slogans that say, "End racism." Eliminate hate. You'll see that. Choose love. All wonderful things, all completely impossible for us to do. All wonderful things, all completely impossible. Because they're not the issue. They're a symptom of the issue. The issue is we have rebelled against our King. We have rebelled against our King, and we have created an atmosphere that is filled with sin, and those things are going to happen in a world filled with sin. We cannot eliminate the results of sin. We cannot fix ourselves. Our world spends billions of words and billions of dollars and countless numbers of hours of time and energy trying to fix the effects of sin, and we cannot. We cannot fix this world because it was formed on a foundation and an atmosphere of rebellion against God. Now that is a hard lesson. That is a hard, unpleasant, unjoyful lesson to learn. But I think that's what we see. In Genesis, one of the purposes of this is to give us a clear, accurate picture of the world that we live in. Who are we? Who is God? Who are we? How do we interact with each other? And I think that's exactly what we see here. The world is sinful because we've rebelled against God, and we cannot fix it. We cannot make the effects of sin go away. Now, that would be a terrible, terrible thing if it ended there, if that was the end. But there's one more lesson we see in this chapter. When God paints this desperately black picture of our own failure and our own inability to fix it and the tragic consequences of it. He paints that black picture, but then he shines a bright, beautiful light of hope into the middle of it. This would be terrible if it weren't for the last lesson that we're going to talk about, and that's this. God's plan has always been to save those who call on him. His plan has always been to save those who call on him. We see that with Abraham in chapter 12. Again, I'm looking ahead just a little bit, but verse 8 of chapter 12, it says this, "From there he, Abraham, went on toward the hills east of Bethel and pitched his tent. There he built an altar to the Lord and called on the name of the Lord." We said that from Abraham, God made a promise to Abraham, "I'm going to bless all the nations through you." What is that blessing? That God's going to fix all their problems here on earth? No, that he will save them out of this. You see, the promise to Abraham is not, "Abraham, I'm going to fix the world through you. I'm going to eliminate war. I'm going to eliminate disease. I'm going to eliminate all the things that just suck about this world. You're going to be the one that fixes them." See, we look for that in the world. If we just elect this person, they'll fix all the world or all the problems in our country. If we just, get the right medication, we'll cure cancer. If we just get this thing, we're looking for that one thing that's going to fix all the problems. God said, it's not going to happen. I'm going to give you a great promise. It's going to come through Abraham, but it's not going to be to fix this world. It's going to be to save out of this world those who call on him. So Abraham said, "I'll call on you, God." Yeah, God, I'm looking to you. I'm looking to you in this world. I'm looking to you to do what I can't do, and that's to save me. Save me from this world of conflict and strife and racism and murder and theft and anger and adultery and hatred and sin. I can't fix it, but you can save me out of it. Remember we started this with Acts 17:26. It says, "From one man God made every nation of men, that they should inhabit the whole earth. He determined the time set for them and the exact places where they should live." That's what we see happening here in Genesis. God is setting the nations, giving them their place and their time. But the next verse in Acts 17 is so wonderful. It says why he did that. Verse 27. It says, God did this. He created these nations. He did all that stuff with Noah. He set the nations in place and the races in place. God did this so that men would seek him and perhaps reach out to him and find him, though he is not far from each one of us. See, God's plan was not to create this utopia on earth. We ruined that. He did that. The Garden of Eden. Sin ruined it. God said, all right, I'm not going to fix this world. I'm not going to redeem this world. I'm not going to redeem the nations. I'm not going to redeem political theories. I'm going to save individuals out of it, those who call on me. God did this so that men would seek him and reach out for him. Seek him and reach out for him. When you see the darkness of the world, if you've been lost in the dark, I spent a lot of time in the woods, and you get lost sometimes in the woods. And as a young boy, I would sometimes be out in the woods, and it would get dark, and I wouldn't know where I was. That's a terrible feeling, because in the woods, it's darker than it is out in the fields. And you can't see, but if you see a light through the trees, it's like, the whole world opens up. It didn't brighten up the whole, it's not like the sun came out, now I can see everything, but I can see that light, and I'm going there. That's what this is. God says the world around us, the nations, have been formed in sin, and they're not going to change. And you see and feel the effects of it. But I'm going to shine a light. I'm going to make a promise. I can save you out of it. I can take you out of it if you call on me. Romans 10, verse 13 says, "For everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved." Everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. What that means is simply this. It's just to look at God and say, you know what? I know that regardless of what anybody else might have done, regardless of what Noah did or Nimrod did or my neighbor did or the Russians did, I have rebelled against you. I have. I am in rebellion against you, and I am guilty. But God, you say that you will pay the penalty for my rebellion against you. You sent your son Jesus, who didn't rebel against you on this earth, and he died. He was executed as a rebel, even though he didn't rebel. But you did that on purpose. He was paying my penalty. So if I say to God, I'm in rebellion against you, I have no leg to stand on. But I believe you sent Jesus to pay the penalty for my rebellion. And I call on you and I say, yes, Jesus, pay the penalty for my sins. God, forgive my foolishness and bring me home. That's what it means to call on the Lord, I think. God makes you a promise. If you do that, you are saved. You don't leave this earth now. But you have a home to look forward to. This earth is no longer the end for you and I. This earth is no longer the sum total of who we are and what we experience. We change. And we walk through this world with God, just like Abraham did. Walk with God. So, as we head into Abraham next week, I realize I painted a dark picture on purpose, because I think that's the picture God paints. I think that's it. This world is dark, but there is a bright, shining light in the middle of it. There is a beautiful, glorious light beckoning you to come home, to call on the name of your Creator, your Father, who put you here now, so that you would perhaps reach out to Him, call out to Him. I pray that you and I would. Lord, thank you that you have a plan. That plan includes us. It includes nations. God, we just want to be calling out to you. Help us to do that, God. Help us to see and to hear you, to see and to hear your voice in this world now, and to reach out and to call on you. We ask you to help us do that, Lord, in Jesus' name. Amen. We're going to take a 3-minute break. 3 minutes.